Good afternoon. I am Debra Titone, Associate Vice Principal Research, and I am thrilled to join you today to celebrate the launch of a very important anthology with the world to choose from, celebrating 7 decades of the Beatty Lecture at McGill University. As has been noted, the Beatty Lecture is an enduring, distinguished tradition at McGill that has provided a platform for public discourse by some of the world's leading thinkers for 67 years. It is a great honor for me to welcome you to this discussion between two of these leading thinkers, McGill Professor Emeritus Charles Taylor and Dr. Rowan Williams. Throughout his long and accomplished career at McGill, Professor Taylor has brought great honor to his alma mater and has been praised for his dedication to political unity and his respect for cultural diversity. His views have changed the way people all over the world think about some of the most basic questions of human life. Professor Taylor's ideas appear in 2 chapters of With the World to Choose From. In 1993, he moderated Mikhail Gorbachev's Beatty Lecture, which took the form of a roundtable discussion with former Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and McGill professors Valentin Boss and Reuven Brenner, which I encourage people to watch as I did at the Beatty Lecture Digital Archives. In 2017, Professor Taylor took to the Beatty podium to deliver the lecture, The Challenge of Regressive Democracy, which I also encourage people to watch. Dr. Rowan Williams is an outstanding theological writer, scholar, and poet, and the former Archbishop of Canterbury and retired Master of Magdalene College, Cambridge. Dr. Williams graciously agreed to contribute a preface to Professor Taylor's 2017 lecture. In this preface, Dr. Williams writes that Taylor is an indispensable voice of both sanity and depth in our public debates, and we have good cause to be grateful. I am indeed very grateful to you both for joining us today, and it is here on the topic of importance, indeed the necessity of public debate, that I wish to launch your discussion. Professor Taylor, let's begin with your thoughts on the subject. This is a time of excitement and innovation, but also of contradiction and fierce debate in our public conversations. What is the place of public debate of the sort espoused by the Beatty Lecture and other public forums?
I think it's absolutely essential because the way things are very often put before the electors is 2 absolutely different accounts, even presupposing different realities, and highly oversimple. And the actual issues we face are tremendously complex, and you can't solve one part of the problem without looking at other parts. So how to raise the level? Now, so public intellectuals are supposed to do this, and I suppose in a way they do in different ways. People writing in, for instance, in newspapers, columnists, and so on. But I think we also have to look at other methods. And there is another method that comes to mind where you get together, you might call it a consultative committees. This has been done in Ireland, it was done in BC, and it actually in France, the president, faced with the revolt of the Yellow Vests, did something similar. People representative of the whole population, but willing to come together and talk and work through a problem. And that's tremendously important, not only because it brings all that input, but because when you do that kind of thing, you can't allow one-line solutions. So somebody says, what we got to do is this. And then somebody else will say, well, look, that has other consequences that we have to cope with, and so on. And you finally get sometimes a spread of different possibilities that can then be voted on by referendum or selected by various parties, but they really are thought through. And it's the absence of thought through ideas, which is really terrifying in our present political situation.
Your comments remind me of, in your Beatty lecture, you talked about the perpetual struggle of democracy and how it's not just an escalator going up, but it's a process. So Do you find that what you're commenting now relates to what you talked about in your Beatty lecture back then?
Absolutely. I mean, democracy is never going to be completed. It's never going to be, it's always going to be very fragile. And what we get in history are very often periods when you're obviously getting a bit further towards it and periods when you're sliding away from it. And I think we've just passed through 30 or so years more where we've been sliding away from it. I mean, through mythical understandings like neoliberalism, that together with globalization producing certain consequences and so on and so on. And we're struggling to turn the thing around and begin to move back. And it's become even more difficult when we try to move back because of a number of factors, including the unavailability of a commonly accepted truth, which is another problem we have to resolve.
Thank you. So Dr. Williams, I invite you to comment on what your thoughts are about the role of public intellectuals in society.
I'd very much echo what Charles has said. And there are 2 points that come to mind as I listen and reflect on this. One is the importance in society of reminding people that there are some questions to which the answer is not just managerial. It's not just about working out a kind of technology to resolve a yes or no question. There are longer term, deeper issues. Where do we want to get to? What are the consequences of decisions we're now making? And what does the society actively want? And always the temptation is to present large issues as simply issues of management. We can cut it up this way, we can cut it up that way. So let's take a straw vote. Which would you like? So that's one thing, the managerial approach to long-term problems. Of course, we have to have people with managerial skills, but if that's all that we ever discuss in public debate, we really are going to be at a loss. The second thing, I think, relates very closely to what Charles was just saying, and that is we often need to pause and say, are we asking the right question here? And sometimes a major process of public consultation and reflection needs to be focused more on whether we're asking the right question than what is the right answer. You can have a question put to you, once again, in simple yes or no, black and white terms. And many people would step back and say, but what if it's not that kind of binary alternative? What if there are other ways of looking at this? What if the question were different? And I remember in the aftermath of the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, people saying, well, what exactly was the question? It appeared to be a very simple question. Do we want to be inside the European Union or out? But in fact, as the result and the consequent series of negotiations showed, I think, that question was not nearly as simple as it looked, and very few people had stopped to ask on either side, where exactly are we going with this? What are the larger constraints in a larger mental and moral world that ought to be weighing with us? So the consultation process, the processes of grassroots democracy, of citizens' assemblies and democratic consultation, I would say are absolutely essential to the good working of democracy, if they are conceived as the kind of forum in which you can clarify the question, not just look for short-term answers. And it's in that context, I think, that the role of the public intellectual comes in. The person who can ask the awkward question, who can ask, is the question well put? The person who can say, what are we looking for beyond a managerial solution? And how do we express longer-term values, desires, and goals?
Thank you very much for your interesting comments. It leads me to reflect on the 2 Beatty lectures that I saw that Professor Taylor participated in. One of the recurring questions that seems to have appeared is this tension between diversity and unity, and how do you balance those things within a society? So Professor Taylor, I wondered if you can comment a bit on that and how you see how things evolved since the time of your Beatty lecture till today's time?
Well, they've gotten in a way much worse, because the issue that is actually before the public in many societies is whether to accept or not certain kinds of diversity. We find the challenge of what people call populist, I think is a bad word, but let's leave it standing. The Trumps, the Le Pens, the Salvinis in Italy, what they're offering is a kind of closing down of the society, a rejection of certain possible members, possible immigrants, or big parts of the existing society, which are considered to be not really belonging to it. So there you have something very, 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 very difficult, because it's clear that, anyway, I speak for myself, I'm utterly on one side of this particular debate, but how to reach across and convince the other side. I mean, if I can use examples from very much at home, very much in Quebec, we have in Quebec, as you know, legislation put in by the present government, which is very discriminatory against certain religious practices, particularly Muslim. And this is something which is, very contrary to the report that we brought out with Jean Boujard, and also utterly unacceptable. But you ask yourself the question, how do the people who are putting it forward justify it? And they have this conception of l'identité québécoise, right? The Quebec identity and so on. And here, the debate has got to be about the very fundamental values that we consider really important. If the word values is correct. The convincing people that a society in which you speak to people that are different from you, but who really want to join the society and contribute, is much richer than a society in which you shut them out. And that means that you have to understand what motivates people to support that kind of legislation. And I must say, in my case, I had a wonderful education, which was the commission that we had in 2007-8. We went all around the province and talked to people. And the certain fears arose. People asked the question, est-ce qu'ils vont nous changer? Will they change us, these people coming from outside? They were terrified of that. And if you look deeply into Quebec history, into the fight to maintain this identity here, you can understand where that fear comes from. Now, answering it is a more difficult task, but you can't even begin to unless you understand and can understand sympathetically what's driving those people to vote for that party, which will put through that. Now, you have to think of that rather than the utter cynicism, I believe, of the leadership that surfs on that kind of fear, right? And you got to, as it were, set aside for a minute your indignation against the Parti québécois, the CAQ, and so on, and look at the kind of fears and try to understand them and reach out to them.
Professor Williams, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I think that really illustrates in very concrete form the importance of trying to find what the right question is to ask. I've sometimes said about Brexit, it's a solution in search of a problem. It's not really an answer to any very specific question. It's the result of a very complex set of discontents and disjunctions in British society. But if you're going to get anywhere with it, it is, as Charles has said, it's no use simply saying, well, this is something that comes from an uneducated and prejudiced populace that we really need to override or educate into thinking better. First of all, you start by saying, well, exactly what problems do you think this is meant to be solving? Let's get specific here. And that's a long job, but I think it's a crucial one, because otherwise you will end up with politicians saying, as they frequently say, with all the cynicism that has been mentioned, here is the magic solution which will solve whatever problem you want to throw at it. And that's no way to do politics. you need that patient work of saying, where are the specific questions now to which we need answers? How do we find them? So I'm very sympathetic to this idea that, first of all, you try to understand what it is that people are anxious about, what they want to defend, what they're worried they might be losing. And of course, that applies also when you're trying to come to terms with a culturally different presence within your society. I've sometimes find myself talking to people who are very suspicious, say, of Muslim communities in the United Kingdom, and saying, well, when it comes to it, I would guess that your Muslim neighbors would like their children to be safe in the streets, and would like them to have jobs when they grow up, and would like them to go to schools that will equip them for life in this society. The vast majority of people have that kind of common aspiration. Let's try to meet them at that level, at least in some contexts. And I remember some 10 or 15 years ago, when I was Archbishop, we were involved in putting together a scheme called Near Neighbours, which was an attempt to create grassroots projects around the country where different faith groups and different ethnic groups shared in the development of particular community projects to resolve issues that were precisely about keeping the roads safe or keeping the schools open or managing public libraries, that kind of thing. Just to act as a reminder that so often what you think are the unbridgeable gulfs between you and the stranger are not in fact quite so apocalyptic and quite so deep. Now, of course, that's not to say there's never conflict, obviously not. But to work hard at how you become, and Charles has heard me say this elsewhere, how you become recognizable to each other in these circumstances, that is part of the democratic challenge, I think, and part of the challenge of really sane politics.
Yeah, I'd like to come in on that and agree very, very greatly. I mentioned this mechanism of a consultative committee, but there's also another thing that I don't think we're ever going to get out of our present problems in democracy unless we foster it more, and that is this kind of local coming together with people because they have an actual problem. It may be the problem in certain cases of the no more jobs because the big industries moved out. So what do we want? What are the real possibilities and which of these do we want? And you find when that starts that a lot of fears and worries about the other and as it were stereotypes of the other just fall away. People begin to meet and talk, and they, as Rowan says, they all have certain very common interests. They all want jobs in this case, or they want their kids to have a good education. But that also is a kind of clarification of what we're in politics about, what we're in politics for. Analogous in a way to what these consultative committees can give, but from a very different standpoint. And they create local communities that are pretty well unrecruitable by purely demagogic fears and so on, that are just, to look at the American case and make America great again. But if you have the local community which is suffering from globalization, loss of jobs, but they have a project of how they can solve that. They know what to demand of the state and federal governments, right? And they can't be fought off with "Make America Great Again" or some such slogan. There's a kind of a lesson in realism. I think this is another avenue in the reconstruction of democracy. There are actually several avenues that we need to look at, and this is definitely a very important one.
And that suggests in turn, doesn't it, that the identity that works constructively in politics is an identity that is goal-oriented, not oriented towards what you're not and the fear and anxiety of what you're not, but trying to identify what you positively do want. And I can recall a conversation years ago with a politician from another country who shall be nameless. And we got onto issues like this, and I said, well, I know you've told me very clearly what you want to avoid in the next 6 weeks, but what would you like to achieve in the next 5 years? And that's the problem, I think, that often afflicts the political discourse we're used to, that we encourage people to define themselves by giving them obvious targets, obvious others to reject. We don't invite them, as we ought, to pull together in this way. But all of that, I think, is, as I say, absolutely fundamental to a well-working democracy, and the whole tradition of citizens organizing, which begins in the States, which has some very effective expressions in the UK as well. That's part of this business of trying to identify what it is we can resolve together without simply creating easy scapegoats.
So I have another question for the two of you. What are your thoughts? Is intellectual life in decline now? Professor Taylor.
I don't see that in general. I think that certainly there are real barriers to the best sort of intellectual treatments and discussion penetrating into the political sphere. And one of them is really very worrying, is this growth of a totally alternative views of the world, which, total falsehoods get baked in. But it's interesting to see why and how. Partly through the operation of social media, which people can get captured by, and partly by people's, there's a certain vulnerability to conspiracy theories. If somebody says, what I'm telling you now is what they're not allowing you to know, and only a few people really grasp that there's a big plot of what, somehow a lot of people feel flattered by being addressed in that way and being invited to join that club. And there are all sorts of reasons why this is working on a much wider scale, partly the existence of these social media, partly the fact that certain of the standard media, between television and newspapers, have been sucked into this. You can think of, in our context, Québécois, the Journal de Montréal, and so on. We had this, when we'd had the commission, the Journal de Montréal did everything they could to upset us, because they knew that we knew that their accounts of the incidents which really set off the fear of foreigners and so on were largely doctored. They actually introduced things that didn't happen. For instance, it's supposed to be a terrible scene in which Muslims demanded that the pea soup at the cabane à sucre forever have no ham. Whereas all that had happened was a small group of Muslims came in and said, "Would you mind making another bowl of pea soup without ham?" So the audience, the population was really whipped up by this kind of, frankly, untruths. And so this is a standing real danger that we have to somehow get through and penetrate. And I have to say, I have partial solutions to suggest, but I don't really know how to make a real dent in the very, very big problems. Take the example of the fears about vaccination. It's extraordinary how some people, the idea circulating that it's going to change your DNA so that you have some kind of monsters as children. It's just something jaw-dropping, but it's very, very powerful in our society. It's becoming a real obstacle to doing certain things. I'm a little bit of, we can nibble at this around the edges by making by making social media more responsible, making it take down the stuff more quickly. I think we ought to be able to have court cases against Fox and in our case, what I call Fox North, but for deliberate lies. In other words, treated like a calumny against an individual, where you say you've got to print a rebuttal, a take back, or pay some, or maybe end or pay something very, very serious. But there's something very deep going on in our society which makes this possible, which I don't fully know how to get through.
No, there's, I think, a real psychology of attraction here, which you've put your finger on, that people feel, yes, as you say, flattered by being invited into the circle of those who know, but it's also rooted, isn't it, in the sense that people feel they need to be flattered because they feel they don't have a stake in things. They don't trust the structures, the armature of the society they're part of. They don't feel part of it, in fact. So to be invited to be part of something which actually tells you what the truth is, it's very, very seductive. And you know perfectly well that it's no use just saying, well, look, there's the evidence, because the answer will always come back, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? And so somehow one has to ask the question of how trust in institutions and trust in community is restored, how people feel they have a stake in public truth and public reason. And I use the word reason very generally there, but public reasoning, the capacity to have evidence-based public discussion. And a great deal in our media culture pulls against that. Even, again, in our context, and I'm sorry to go back to Brexit again, the ground was rolled for a long time, as we say, by lots and lots of entirely false stories about how the European Commission worked or how the European courts worked. I'm not saying there weren't problems with the European Union and our relation to it. Of course there were. But the force, the popular energy, came from the acceptance of these stories, rather like the stories you tell about Muslims and pea soup. Stories about how the bureaucrats in Brussels were going to standardize this or abolish that. And a great deal of that was complete fiction, and acknowledged by those who wrote it as complete fiction in retrospect. And yet it had that effect of consolidating alienation, suspicion, and the desire to have a perspective independent of all that, which you could trust because it trusted you. Very complex bundle of things, isn't it? And I think you're right that is one of the challenges the intellectual life in the broadest sense has these days. But I suppose if I were honest, I would say that the other side of it is that there's also, certainly in the UK, perhaps also in Canada, a very strong trend in the educational world to think in instrumentalist terms. The raising of large questions of value, of long-term meaning, isn't much encouraged. And there's a premium, certainly in the United Kingdom, increasingly, on an education that is basically designed to get you a salary, rather than to build you a brain. And people talk about assessing the successfulness of universities, for example, by the average income of their graduates. In which case, no carer, no elementary school teacher will have been well taught in a good university because they won't earn the salary that would tell you that they'd somehow got a good education. And that does frighten me. I think that reductiveness of how we approach education, the notion that you are essentially going through a process of higher education in order to maximize your salary. That becomes a vicious circle eventually. It reacts back on the kind of things that count as good or effective research, good or effective teaching. And I think it's a real danger in our institutions.
So
that's part of. Sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead. Okay, I'll just follow up.
Well, that's part of what Rowan's just talking about. The other side of measuring the success of university education by the salary is measuring the importance of funding universities by what it's going to contribute to the economy. And once you do that, what we call the humanities, or good old-fashioned humanities, seem to be less and less valid. I mean, how do they add to GNP? Well, I'm not quite sure how. Learning better history or doing better philosophy. But of course, if you want to have these kind of very profound reflections on what's going wrong, it helps to have read some history. It helps to have read some philosophy. It helps to have read some theology and so on. And so you get the universities pushed into, I think this is very much the case in Britain at the moment, and we're all threatened with this, that the universities are pushed to downplay and downgrade and reduce the kind of the side of their teaching which contributes to this kind of deep reflection.
And I think it's also a problem for the pure sciences as well as the humanities, that the notion that you can take intellectual risks, as science always has done, that you can devote your attention to the abstractions of astrophysics or to pure mathematics without any very immediate short-term gain. And yet, again, those are the things that create an intellectual world in which all sorts of new things become possible.
Oh.
So in the context of this discussion, I wondered what your thoughts were on the roles of public intellectuals here. Some might say that they have a role to articulate the shared impulses of society or to contradict these impulses. What are your thoughts? What responsibilities do public intellectuals have in this?
I think he's just trying to tell the truth as they see it about what's really important, what's going wrong, what we should be talking about, what issues are being just shunted aside and not looked into, whatever is really missing in the debate as you see it going on. I think the whole role, unless they contribute to the debate becoming more real, more focused, more, as it were, connected with real human life, then they aren't helping. They aren't doing the kind of job that they can do. I mean, they can do for public debate, for democratic society. I think that's the the task that they have. So there's nothing very specific that you could give sort of in very general terms at all times in all places. There's only really what right now appears obvious to certain people is missing, the angle, the take on it, the questions to ask that are just being quietly shunted aside or considered irrelevant.
I think that's always a good way of approaching it, to begin by asking, well, what are people not asking here? What are the elephants in the room? Perhaps the public intellectual is a professional identifier of elephants in rooms at times. But one of the things which I think, Charles, you've made me see very clearly in this discussion so far is a paradox that in so many instances, the public intellectual is or may be someone who, rather than operating exclusively at a high theoretical level, is a person with a bit of an eye for the particulars and the specifics that are being left out. And in a strange way, can become the one who brings the discussion back to earth from the absurdly inflated and unreal language that a certain kind of politics encourages. And I think that's one of the really important things about a successful exercise of that public intellectual witness, or even, as I might say, ministry, that there's a capacity to join up with the local and the particular, and to say, well, no balloon-like solution is going to work that doesn't at some point have traction with this particular problem, with this history, this culture, this story, this background. We have somehow to approach that with respect and attention and spend time with it and not hurry to the comforting generalities. So rather than the intellectual being somebody who keeps on spouting comforting generalities, the intellectual is the person who reminds folk of uncomfortable particulars.
Okay. So Professor Taylor, I wondered if I could ask you to reflect directly on your experience of delivering the 2017 Beatty Lecture and in moderating Gorbachev's 1993 lecture. And perhaps in doing so, you could think prospectively about when we can finally get to the point to gather together in an auditorium and listen to new public lectures, what topics would be most prescient to explore?
Well, that's a very interesting question. harking back to the 2017 lecture, something that we haven't thrown in yet, but which is part of it. Rowan was talking earlier about, I was talking too about how people get flattered by the idea you're in the know. And this partly makes up for or lessens a sense of not being recognized. But there's another way of looking at this, I think, and this is what I talked about in that Beatty lecture a lot, that people feel, I use this expression, citizen efficacy, the sense that you have that as a citizen, I can do something, I can go and do something. I mean, which in a way, I feel I've already voted in our election, going into the poll. Yeah, I'm going to re-elect my MP or something like that. But a lot of people just don't feel it, and they feel utterly helpless. And they feel utterly helpless because they don't see in all this machinery any way that they can intervene to make a difference. So they have all these terrible problems. They can't get a job, or their kids can't get a job, or they only get a very partial, precarious job, and so on. But what can they do about it? And in a way, the appeal of the demagogues is to give them the sense of efficacy. I mean, make America great again. Wow, you're all going to get jobs. We're going to bring the jobs back, and so on. And so it's recreating the sense of efficacy. Now, that's where all the different things we are talking about have a role. I mean, for instance, this talk about the local community coming to see what it really needs and what it has to demand and so on, immediate rise in citizen efficacy. I mean, they may fail, but they know exactly where to start pushing, what to start asking for, and so on. And it's another way of putting it is how to render the whole democratic machinery less opaque. It's for lots of people, it's really totally opaque. And that's why the deliberation of saying, just vote for this referendum, yes to getting out of the EU, that's going to do it all. It'll all come cascading down. So the trouble is that increasing that sense of efficacy would be the fruit of a whole lot of different initiatives, right? Both the local ones and the ones we're talking about. And it doesn't have a single lever to pull. That's the seductive attraction of these demagogues, that they give you the single lever to pull. And so it's all very complex and very multifaceted, but that is something we should keep our eye constantly on. How the system is opaque, how people feel, I don't know where to move, I don't know what to touch, I don't know what lever to pull, or the levers I'm given to pull, voting either Labour or Tory or whatever it is, don't seem to make any difference. I pull this lever and nothing happens. It's that kind of change in people's sense of where they belong and what they can do that we have to produce. Otherwise, we really will. Our democratic society will be in danger of real death. I mean, really being substituted for by some terrible system. Because what these demagogues all seek is irreversibility. They're looking for a way that they think can't be flipped back. I mean, this is what you see with the Republicans in the United States. And of course, you see this in spades with people like Orban and in Hungary, and the PES in Poland and so on, or Erdogan. We're going now to the very edges of what can be legitimately called democracies, but we could all slide there. You see, we could all slide over there so that the system will be baked in, that it has keeps a certain solution alive, whatever. And then the sense of opacity will be reflecting a reality. There's nothing you can do just about to change it.
Thank you. Professor Williams, do you have any comments on that question? What would be the topics of the future that we should be discussing in public forum?
One of the most difficult, and I think one of the most unacceptable in the ears of a lot of people, would be something to do with the nature and the limits of sovereignty. We're in a world where so many of the major problems we confront are transnational, where whether it's pandemic disease or environmental disaster, crises don't stop at the boundaries. And we've discovered in the last 18 months or so how very difficult it is to get intelligent, coordinated global responses to global problems. Now, people are quite rightly suspicious of globalist solutions of a certain kind. They don't want big international executive bodies. But if you're not going to have that, and you probably shouldn't, what are the actual structures and instruments of shared action that can be put into position when we are faced, and as we shall be again and again and again, with these questions that are not just national? We can roll out the language of sovereignty as much as we like, but we're not going to be able to stop pandemics at the border just by saying so. And we're not going to prevent environmental crisis just by pretending it's an issue for people on the other side of the world. And if we haven't learned that this year, I don't know what will teach us. So that would be very near the top of my concern, not just issues about disease and the environment, but about what the structures are we need to respond effectively and democratically to them. That's one thing. And I think the other thing, which we've touched on directly and indirectly quite a bit in this conversation, is how we should be rethinking education with an eye to critical citizenship.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this. I'm wondering how some of the issues, and I think Professor Taylor alluded to this before in one of his comments, how some of these issues that are recurring within society, upon which public intellectuals reflect, have really come to the fore in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Perhaps we can conclude our conversation on that topic that's on everyone's mind, obviously.
Well, I think that one of the things where we were really going wrong is we got, partly by sort of neoliberal outlook of the market can do everything, partly through globalization, combined with that, we starved the public sector in all our Western democratic societies, right? And we starved it because because of the competition of globalization. If you tax too heavily the rich or the corporations and so on, they risk going elsewhere. So we allowed ourselves to be pushed more and more into a situation in which the tremendous effort of the economy was in producing goods for private consumption and selling them preferably internationally. And all the things that we can only do in common, like health systems, caring for the old, were vastly underfunded just about everywhere. I mean, it's much worse in the States than elsewhere, but even what we consider well-ordered welfare states like Canada and Quebec, we were allowed ourselves to be pushed in this direction. And in the European case, the response to the 2008 crisis was austerity. So in all these cases, we produced a situation in which when we were hit with the pandemic, we just didn't have the means in many ways to face it. And that is, I think, a really sobering fact. I think it's the one thing that gives me some real hope coming out of the pandemic, if we do ever come out. Let's hope we do. That this lesson will have been learned, that we can't be talked again by certain politicians into, no, you can't raise taxes, no, you can't do this, you can't do that, or you can't overspend and so on. We really, this plus, of course, the global crisis of the climate, really should have put paid to that. Well, we shall see, but I think that is one of the really great potential benefits of this, that it did show up things that were always somehow swept under the carpet.
I think that's right. I think that part of the impact of the pandemic has been simply to lay bare some of what's been going on and to focus our minds on the fact that whatever the mythology of the last 30 odd years, there simply are goods for society that you can only achieve together. And securities you can only achieve together and cooperatively and reciprocally. I am safe when you're safe. And the cliche in the early days of the pandemic, and I suppose it survived a little bit, is nobody is safe until everyone is safe. And that's not just a medical observation. I think it's an observation about how society actually works, that security is indivisible at the end of the day. And a security or a prosperity, a wealth that is simply focused concentrated in one sector of society is inevitably insecure, dangerous to those who have it and dangerous to those who don't. So that's one thing. The other thing I noted in, say, the first 6 to 9 months of the pandemic in the UK was an increasing awareness of people who are most on the front line when crises arrive. Carers, health workers, public workers of various kinds, and the question of whether we adequately reward and recognize the kinds of risk, the kind of exposure that people like that take. We realized what should have been fairly obvious, that people like that were living with a much higher level of risk than most, and yet with a much lower level of recompense than some. And I devoutly hope we don't forget that, because who we reward and what for, what kinds of work, what kinds of achievement we regard as worth acknowledging and rewarding, that tells us a lot about the kind of society we are.
Thank you very much for those comments. I just want to say, in preparation for this, I watched the Beatty Lectures of Professor Taylor with Mikhail Gorbachev, and also your lecture, and I was just struck by how common and consistent the same themes were from that era to the current era. It just seems to play out in different ways, but the questions are always the same, it feels like. I want to thank our guests today, Professor Charles Taylor and Professor Rowan Williams, for a really interesting discussion, harkening back to Professor Taylor's contributions to the Beatty Lecture on 2 separate occasions. Again, I just want to emphasize to the people here that really going back and revisiting those lectures and also looking at it in the context of this book, which we celebrate today, about the Beatty Lectures, is really worthwhile, and many of the themes are very appropriate even today. And I just want to thank you both very much. Thank you, Professor Taylor and Professor Williams.
Thank you, Deborah.
You.